One of the analogies that you've drawn is a comparison between banks and a company that pollutes water. So can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yes. So there's a few things that banks do that essentially you can really quite nicely map into not just polluting the financial system and the economy, but polluting when there is a really clean alternative that is not more expensive. And the reason they pollute is only because they get more subsidies and they get more for themselves doing it that way. What's that? That is, for example, living so dangerously that they have almost no equity. Not enough equity money, shareholder money in their investments, funding with so much debt that nobody else in the economy lives like that. I don't think that people appreciate that banks are the only, or in financial institutions, especially the ones that actually can get away with it, that have some safety net guarantee type of thing, are the only ones that live on single-digit amount of equity out of total. Nobody, I mean, the banks wouldn't lend to somebody who had the balance sheet that they have. They would want a lot more equity. So if you take that balance sheet that you started with and embed it in the real world as a balance sheet that's not attached to a bank with deposit insurance and other things, everybody would not come near that to lend to that entity because there's so much opacity and so much other debt that you don't know where you fit in if you were to lend them. The fact that the banks get anybody to lend to them, including depositors, is only because somebody else bears some of the downside. And that's the pollution, is that the more they borrow, the less equity they have, the more fragile is the entire system, because it makes it so that a little change or a scandal can, not the London Whale, because JP Morgan is so large that it can absorb $9 billion, but some people say we're 2 London Whales away from a crisis. I view London Whale as a warning on the governance, because the risk controls are so poor. So the pollution is just living, being interconnected and having a lot of debt that can sort of get contagion going.
There was a very interesting graphic yesterday, which within the journalism community is common knowledge and within the academic community is common knowledge, but I don't think the public is aware that from 2006 to now, the 5 largest banks in the United States and then just the global largest banks have actually increased in size and increased their market share of the financial world. So that's part of the reason that JP Morgan was able to absorb $20 billion in fines this year. Do you think that is the end of the cost of doing business? Jamie Dimon has specifically said that we're wiping the slate clean. We're settling all these charges to shareholders. He intimated that quite clearly, that this was the end. This was the blank slate.
Let's see.
Do you believe that they have the fortress balance sheet, JP Morgan in particular, because they're the standout bank from the crisis?
JP Morgan Chase is far from a fortress. JP Morgan Chase is among the most dangerous institutions in the world, among the few, and certainly it is by far the largest entity, and the fortress is far from a fortress. You started with that. In the graphs that we saw yesterday, there was a graph about exposure to derivatives. JP Morgan Chase is among the ones that's the most active in these markets. And the amount of the so-called notional, but notional amounts are in the tens of trillions of dollars. And so it's true that that's not like true, the situation in which they'll owe that money is remote, but there is exposure there, even if you take it to a tenth of that or a fraction of that. And in a situation where a lot of things are kind of, in distress, is major. So JP Morgan Chase is far from the image of a fortress at all.
It's a hard case to sell to investors because the optimism that comes with a recovery and the self-fulfilling prophecy of wanting a recovery then leads to their shares rising very rapidly. And there are the movements toward change. There was the Fed's plan that they came up for living wills. And when that happens, it's a hard case for me as a journalist to try and pitch the idea that we should do something about it because we don't know when the music stops. It's like a game of musical chairs. No investor wants to be the one standing up, but everyone wants to have a chair in the meantime.
Of course, JP Morgan Chase can be profitable. JP Morgan Chase is in a great position because there's no way there's virtually no way that the investors lose on that. The cheap borrowing that JP Morgan Chase benefits by being too big to fail is to the benefit of the shareholders. So a lot of what you see in banks is just the effect of very, very large subsidies. And the bigger you are, the more subsidies you get. So JP Morgan Chase benefits from these subsidies and is able to afford all kinds of things and grow. And as I said, when you make money, you make a lot of money per dollar in these highly leveraged institutions. So sure, recovery is great, and as I said, the good years for the banks were great, but they only planted the seed for the bust that followed. So yes, you can stand, but you pollute the rest of the economy by the fact that to the extent that even your shareholders lose money, it tends to be when everything else goes down. The question about JP Morgan Chase is, what is wrong for the world if JP Morgan Chase does not increases its equity, and by then I'm not even shrinking it, doesn't make payouts, just like Warren Buffett. Why can't it have, what it does is it keeps borrowing. Some of this borrowing is not the business of banking. Any kind of borrowing, taking on debt, it makes it more fragile, and there's no reason it should live on more equity.
Very often in conversations about solving the consolidation of market share amongst these banks, people often say to cap it by size. But to me, that doesn't eliminate the fundamental conflicts of interest that come up with not having a separation between different functions of the banking community.
Well, the Glass-Steagall is a complicated issue, so we're not going to be able to resolve this, in the next couple of minutes. But I will just say about that the problem will not be eliminated, and that's the people who argue against Glass-Steagall point rightly to the fact that Lehman Brothers was an investment bank, and it was systemic. So was AIG, was an insurance company. So you could have, therefore, some system where commercial banks can do lending and they can fail, like savings and loan. So there can be a lot of small ones that fail, like in Spain or whatever. Or you can have investment banks that are in the different world. The point is, you're going to need to regulate all of those whose distress or default can really, have collateral damage. That's the key to all of this. So it's not as much about what they do, but the regulation is only motivated by the fact that they can harm others with their actions. That's when you regulate.
But I've heard the defense before that Lehman was an investment bank, and that's the counter argument to Glass-Steagall. But in response to that, I've usually had to say that would Lehman have been as dire a situation if we didn't know where the money ended, if there wasn't as much interconnectivity, and then the banks
change that?
And then the banks that they were connected to were federally insured on the deposit side. So if it was only if the connectivity was limited to investment banks, and one bank failed, I mean, it's hard.
So what happened actually before Glass-Steagall failed. So by the time the Glass-Steagall actually was abolished, the deposits ended up with the investment banks through layering of all of that. So, put money in money market fund, the money market fund invests in the investment bank. So through all the layers, you get the interconnectedness. So it's very, very hard to parse it. That's why it's so hard to even think. But let me just say, I think Glass-Steagall originally was not actually motivated by systemic risk considerations. It was a consumer protection law when it was first done. So it was more about preventing the investment banks from reaching depositors to sell them securities. And so it was more in that. And the split could be useful for other purposes. But my line there would be, then it would help to create different regulation that depends on what type of institution it is, and making them smaller by function would just help make them more, feasible to regulate, basically, and to control. So I see other advantages to this, but it does not remove the need to regulate basically any entity that we can judge as potential buildup of risk for the system.
Well, moving on from that, I think we should end on a question that thoroughly impresses me, so it's always a good note to end an interview on. It seems to me that many of the groups with outsized political influence would be interested in maintaining the status quo. So what is the process by which we overcome that?
I think the public needs to really express more views on that. There's always a lot of narratives by which the public gets told that there's too much regulation, or if we did this, this and such will happen, and a lot of propaganda that goes on. So that's why my approach has been to try to educate people so that what you have is sort of, on both parties, you have that problem. It's money politics, it's a lot of lobbying, and all of that. And I think if the public says, how come we have the same system that we had that took us down? What will happen next time it implodes? Did we fix it? So I think the regulations are sometimes too complicated, and in some cases too much, but they're not focused on the right thing. You mentioned living wills. You don't need to look at the living wills to know that there is no way JP Morgan Chase can go through bankruptcy, which is what the living wills is asking. So the answer to that question is no. And now the law, the Dodd-Frank law, under Title I of Dodd-Frank, says that the Fed, in particular, has to do something about that. And so the public has to ask the Fed, what are you doing about too big to fail? And the Fed keeps saying, we're working on it. Well, in the end, they're working on it. It says, we created no resolution under FDIC. That's almost as bad as bankruptcy. That's not the solution. Just like the solution to, trucks speeding at 90 miles an hour is not to say, I got some ambulances ready to go. If you can put a speed limit of 60. You want to prevent.
With that, we're going to end the interview there. That's a great line to end it on. Thank you very much for joining us, Professor Admati.
Thank you.